Good morning. My name is Paul Fancher. I'm a partner in the corporate group of Troutman Sanders, and I primarily spend my time representing public companies and all types of corporate and securities matters. In my pro bono practice, I represent nonprofits in a wide variety of corporate and corporate governance matters, including amending and updating their bylaws, which is something that many nonprofits need to do and keep current. Before we start with the presentation, I just wanted to make a few general announcements about the pro bono partnership. First, you'll see in the slides that we've provided the mission of the pro bono partnership, which is to connect attorneys with nonprofits so that they can have many of their legal needs met on a pro bono basis. The next slide provides the eligibility requirements for the pro bono partnership and how you can contact the pro bono partnership if you have questions. Also, I want to go over a couple of legal notes. This webinar is not designed to be detailed legal advice. Rather, it's a general discussion of bylaws. And as with any legal matter, you should consult an attorney if you have specific questions. Also, all rights are reserved for this presentation, so you should not reproduce this presentation without contacting the pro bono partnership. A few notes on bylaws before we get into the substance of the presentation. A nonprofit is governed by the corporate statute in its state of incorporation, regardless of where the nonprofit is located. This presentation assumes that Georgia law applies because I believe that many of the participants are Georgia incorporated nonprofits. However, much of the content of the presentation is applicable to nonprofits that are incorporated in any U.S. jurisdiction. Also, this presentation is not designed to discuss individual bylaw provisions in detail. Rather, it is designed to provide an overview of bylaws, how bylaws fit into the overall corporate governance structure, and to provide an understanding of some of the mistakes that nonprofits make when they're dealing with their bylaws. All right, now let's get started. Bylaws are the internal operating manual for the nonprofit. And many people do not realize that federal and state law actually do not require nonprofits to have bylaws. If a nonprofit does have bylaws, they have to submit them when they're applying for their tax-exempt status, and the vast majority of nonprofits do have bylaws. But it's important to have an understanding that state and federal law gives nonprofits a great deal of flexibility with the content of their bylaws. So just a few notes on why a nonprofit should have bylaws. A very carefully constructed set of bylaws can allow an organization to adopt procedures that are tailored to their specific needs, because naturally nonprofits vary a great deal in size, in their mission, in their affiliations. So there's no one-size-fits-all model, and that's really why you don't want to rely just on the default rules that are included in your state corporation statute. In addition, bylaws can be very effective at helping nonprofits resolve their internal disputes. I routinely represent nonprofits in my pro bono practice, and there's very often disputes within the nonprofit, perhaps between the board members and the executive director. And sometimes when there's not a really strong set of bylaws that guide people in how to resolve these disputes seem to metastasize. And having bylaws, a good set of bylaws that help people understand what the rules are, really help people resolve disputes in an amicable manner. In addition, bylaws are often requested by donors and other and foundations who are considering making an investment in your nonprofit. Next, I want to make sure that we all understand how bylaws fit into the overall corporate governance hierarchy. So, at the top of the hierarchy is the state nonprofit corporation law. This provides a set of default rules for your nonprofit. The state law in Georgia contains provisions that are mandatory, meaning that the nonprofit must abide by them. They include some provisions that can be opted into, other provisions that can be opted out of, and still further provisions that can be altered in your articles or bylaws. And that's why you want to understand the state nonprofit corporation law, because since it's at the top of the hierarchy, if there's ever a disagreement between your bylaws and the state nonprofit corporation law, the state nonprofit corporation law is paramount. And then we move further down the hierarchy. We have the articles of incorporation. If there's some difference between your articles of incorporation and bylaws, again, the articles of incorporation apply. And the same with bylaws and policies and procedures. So, as you may know, articles of incorporation, that is the document that you file with the state to incorporate your nonprofit, and that document is publicly available. The bylaws, on the other hand, are an internal document that are not publicly available unless the nonprofit chooses to make it publicly available. Policy and procedures at the bottom of the hierarchy can cover a broad range of topics, including financial and personnel matters. And we'll talk about them a bit more later in the presentation. So next, I want to just cover some basic bylaw provisions. And again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive analysis of every provision that's often included in bylaws. It's just designed to give you an understanding of common bylaw provisions and things that you should be thinking about when you're adopting or amending your bylaws. The first deals with members. As you probably know, some nonprofits have members, other nonprofits do not have members. The articles of incorporation specify whether a nonprofit has members. If the nonprofit has members, the State Nonprofit Corporation Code provides default rules for the rights of members and the relationship between the nonprofit and its members. As we've previously discussed, some of these default rules can be changed if you have provisions in your bylaws that so specify. Next, we have directors. Bylaw provisions commonly include items discussing how directors are elected, how many directors you have, the qualifications of directors, terms, resignation, removal, those type of items. The next common provision is on board meetings. Bylaws typically have provisions regarding how the board can call a meeting, how the board should conduct a meeting, including quorum and voting requirements. And before I go any further, I just want to talk about a few common tweaks that nonprofits make to default rules in their bylaws dealing with these topics. Nonprofits can put into their bylaws both reserved powers and supermajority voting. Reserved powers require approval of a certain stakeholder before certain action can take place. For instance, you might have a power reserved to members that the nonprofit cannot amend its articles of incorporation unless the members vote on it. That is an example of a reserved power. Supermajority voting is requiring a voting threshold for certain types of action that is higher than the default rules that are included in the State Nonprofit Corporation Code. An example of supermajority voting is that directors would need 2/3 vote before they can amend the bylaws or recommend that the members amend the bylaws. As we've discussed before, there's no one-size-fits-all model for bylaws. So for certain nonprofits, reserve powers and supermajority voting may make sense, and for other nonprofits, it may not make sense. But it's important to understand that they exist so that you can analyze whether they're appropriate for your nonprofit. Next common bylaw provision deals with committees. Oftentimes I see nonprofits put very detailed provisions in their bylaws about committees, how many committees they should have, how frequently the committees will meet, what the committees have authority to do. Typically, as a general rule, I like to have a very streamlined set of bylaws. Definitely we want to include all important items, but I don't like to include cumbersome provisions in bylaws. So I generally like to see a bylaw provision that just says a nonprofit's board can establish committees of the board and can grant those committees specified powers. With this very general type of provision, a nonprofit board can establish committees by resolution and can dissolve committees also by resolution. And if the nonprofit deems it necessary to have more established procedures for a committee, an important committee like a fundraising committee, a nominating committee, then the committee or the board can adopt a charter for the committee that specifies its powers and how the committee will operate. This way, the bylaws are kept streamlined. Next, bylaws typically include provisions regarding the election or appointment of officers, whether or not the officers are board members, and appointments for an executive director as well. Also, bylaws should generally include a provision indemnifying directors and officers from liability that they may incur associated with the nonprofit. The final general provision is just a provision that relates to how the bylaws can be amended in the future. Generally, we don't want to make it too arduous to amend the bylaws because as the organization grows and develops, its needs will change, and the bylaws should be looked at as a living document that can evolve with the organization, so we don't want to make it too difficult to amend. Next, I want to touch on policies and procedures because policies and procedures tie in oftentimes with bylaws. This slide will give you some common topics for policies. As many of you know that have dealt with nonprofit corporate governance for a while, many nonprofits adopted certain policies in the wake of Sarbanes-Oxley because a couple of provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley applied to all companies in the U.S., including not-for-profits. So a lot of nonprofits adopted document retention policies, whistleblower protections, and at the same time the IRS started focusing more on conflict of interest transactions in nonprofits, so many nonprofits adopted conflict of interest policies. So naturally, these ethics and accountability policies are very common for nonprofits, but there's many other policies and procedures that a nonprofit can have. Many nonprofits have, excuse me, policies and procedures touching on fundraising, and also on finance, investment, internal controls within the organization are also very important, how the nonprofit deals with money. And many nonprofits also have employee handbooks and other personnel or policy manuals. Next, we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls that nonprofits can experience in dealing with their bylaws. And the first really ties in with policies and procedures. Something that I oftentimes see with nonprofits is that their bylaws may have grown over time. Every year they add a page or two regarding this policy or this procedure or something that came up. They don't really know where to put it, so it's just put into the bylaws. And it's important for nonprofits to understand that the bylaws should really be your basic governance framework. It shouldn't try to touch on every little topic. And so the bylaws should not dictate day-to-day operations. If the nonprofit believes that some type of day-to-day operational item needs to be documented, then it should be documented in a policy or procedure. So I've included some examples of items that generally should not make their way into bylaws and should instead be included in policies and procedures. Although we want to continually review the bylaws and routinely update them as circumstances change at the nonprofit, we don't want to put ourselves in a position where the bylaws are frequently changing because they include a lot of day-to-day operational information. In short, detailed information should be included in policies, and the bylaws should only cover your broad corporate governance framework. Another pitfall that I've often seen with nonprofits is that their bylaws do not conform to their practices. Frequently, a nonprofit will adopt a set of bylaws that they may have found on the internet or an attorney gave to them, and they were adopted without much thought or care. Or they may have been adopted with a lot of thought and care, but they were put in a drawer for 20 years and not updated. And so the practices of the nonprofit have fallen out of touch with the bylaws. And so if a nonprofit finds itself in this situation, then the nonprofit should either adjust its practices to conform to the bylaws, or the bylaws should be amended to conform to practices, or some combination of both. Generally, I advise nonprofits to stay away from strict deadlines in their nonprofits unless the nonprofit clearly intends to abide by these strict deadlines. If things like deadlines, meeting notices, etc. are not adhered to, then it gives a disgruntled board member, employee, or other stakeholder a reason to call into question an action that the board or members may have taken. So keep your bylaws flexible because it's helpful as the nonprofit changes. Next, I want to talk about a pitfall that applies specifically to Georgia incorporated nonprofits. In Georgia, nonprofit boards can take action by written consent without a meeting. However, the default rule is that written consent must be unanimous by all directors. However, nonprofits are allowed to adjust this default rule and provide for action by written consent with a majority of the board members. I generally encourage nonprofits to put this, Georgia nonprofits, that is, to put this provision into their bylaws because many nonprofits have larger boards and it can be difficult to get consent of every single director on an item outside of a board meeting. Another common pitfall that nonprofits sometimes have in their bylaws is a very complicated due process for removing members, directors, or officers. There are important reasons why people should be entitled to a certain amount of due process. But you want to balance that interest with a very lengthy set of processes that really bog the corporation down so that they cannot take action in a relatively short amount of time if they feel that a board member should be removed. The next pitfall that nonprofits sometimes have are in dealing with electronic forms of communication. So the Georgia Code was updated many years ago, probably 8 or 10, to allow for many modern forms of communication, most importantly, email. And a lot of nonprofits adopted those electronic forms of communication because they're convenient. However, sometimes not-for-profits have an old set of bylaws that might specify that communication has to be by written, mail, by other forms, including facsimile. And if your bylaws provide that certain communications must be in writing, for instance, notices of board meetings, then a nonprofit cannot make use of the flexibility that the Georgia Code provides. So it's important for nonprofits to look at their bylaws and ensure that they do not restrict the use of electronic forms of communication. On a related note, another pitfall is with email voting. I've worked with a number of nonprofits, and it's